Lewis' theory of unlimited supply of labor. So in today's discussion, we will focus on this important theory, which has been a subject matter of development economics. And many economists, especially development economists, have commented on this theory. And this theory still seems to be very important. Okay, now we come to the introduction of this theory. Professor W. Arthur Lewis developed a very systematic theory of economic development with unlimited supplies of labor. So this theory is sometimes known as the theory of unlimited supplies of labor. The theory of unlimited supplies of labor. According to Arthur, in many underdeveloped countries, an unlimited supply of labor is available at the subsistence wage. This we know very clearly because in underdeveloped economies, you can find a number of people working in the agriculture sector. They are working at the subsistence wage. So therefore, for the other sectors, industrial sector or service sector, they can use, in the other sectors can make use of this labor from the agriculture sector. That's why it is said unlimited supply of labor is available at their subsistence wage. That means there are a number of laborers working in the agriculture sector, the subsistence wage, and the other sectors can make use of that labor. So that's why it is often called unlimited supply of labor or unlimited theory of unlimited supplies of labor. Economic development can take place by withdrawing this surplus labor from the subsistence sector to the capitalist or modern industrial sector. That means in agriculture sector, there is a surplus labor. That much labor, the agriculture sector does not require. So more laborers, more than what is required. More laborers are working in the agriculture sector. That's why we say there is surplus labor in the agriculture sector. So economic development can take place by withdrawing the surplus labor from the agriculture sector or subsistence sector to the capitalist sector or the modern industrialist sector. Modern industrialist sector is called the capitalist sector. So you can take labor, surplus labor from the subsistence or agriculture sector to capitalist or modern industrial sector. And through that, an economy can achieve economic development. This is the essence of the argument of Arthur Lewis. So Arthur Lewis theory puts forward the argument that economic development can take place by withdrawing the surplus labor from the subsistence sector to the capitalist or modern industrial sector. The capitalist sector is that part of the economy which uses reproducible capital. Reproducible capital. The subsistence sector is that part of the economy which does not use reproducible capital. So this is how Arthur Lewis distinguishes between the capitalist sector and the subsistence sector. Capitalist sector uses reproducible capital, while the subsistence sector or agriculture sector does not use that kind of reproducible capital. Lewis states that the supply of labor is perfectly elastic at the subsistence wage. In other words, subsistence sector or agriculture sector has surplus labor. The simple meaning is that suppose if you take the labor supply here, then it will be perfectly elastic. This is a labor supply curve. So this wage, which is called the subsistence wage, that remains the same. So at that wage rate, you can have any number of laborers. So it is up to the other sectors how much labor should be demanded. But labor is perfectly elastic. Labor supply is perfectly elastic. It does mean that at the existing wage rate, you can demand any amount of laborers for work in the other sectors. So Lewis states that the supply of labor is perfectly elastic at the subsistence wage. In other words, subsistence sector or agriculture sector has surplus labor. So this much we have to say as the introduction to this Lewis theory of unlimited supplies of labor. So please remember that this theory rests on the assumption that there is surplus labor in the agriculture sector, and this surplus labor in the agriculture sector is working at the subsistence wage, and therefore economic development can take place by withdrawing this surplus labor from the subsistence sector or agriculture sector to the capitalist or modern industry sector. And Lewis distinguishes between the agriculture sector or capitalist sector and subsistence sector on the basis of the nature of the capital that is being used. The capitalist sector uses reproducible capital, whereas the subsistence sector uses non-reproducible capital. So these are way he distinguishes between the capitalist sector and the subsistence sector or the agriculture sector. Now, by surplus labor, we mean that part of the manpower which, even if withdrawn, does not lead to the fall in the amount of output. So when can you say that the labor is surplus? So here we are going to explain the meaning of surplus labor. Let me give you a numerical example to explain the surplus labor. Suppose that we require 50 laborers to use 100 units of output. 100 units of output. Okay. So 50 laborers, we need to produce 100 units of output. But suppose that 70 laborers are employed. 70 laborers are employed. What does it mean? 20 laborers are surplus. That means even if you withdraw these 20 laborers, then also the output does not fall. Output does not come down. Output will remain 100. Because to produce 100 units of labor, you need only 100 units of output. You need only 50 units of labor. Therefore, even if you withdraw 20 units of labor from the production, then also the output remains the same. That means by surplus labor, we mean that part of the labor power, which even if withdrawn, if we withdraw that labor, then the output does not lead to a fall, then that will not lead to a fall in the amount of output. So that's the meaning of surplus labor. So surplus labor is that part of the labor which, even if withdrawn, does not lead to a fall in the amount of output. That means the marginal productivity of surplus labor is negligible or zero, because these 20 units of labors are excess here. Excess here in the sense that marginal productivity of each labor is zero. They are not doing any work. Means they do some work, but their works or their labor power is not required there, is not needed there. In that sense, the marginal productivity is zero or negligible. Therefore, this surplus labor can be withdrawn from the agriculture sector and can be used in the modern sector. So this surplus labor from the agriculture sector or subsistence sector can be withdrawn and that can be used in the modern sector, and through that the economy can develop. This is the argument of Arthur Lewis. Now we will discuss some of the assumptions of the model. This is a two-sector model, and there are two sectors, like one is subsistence sector and the other is the urban industry sector. The model assumes a dual economic structure. Manufacturing, mines and plantations representing the modern sector. The salient features of which are the use of the reproducible capital that we have seen. The modern sector uses reproducible capital. They produce for the market. They produce for profit. They employ labor on wage payment basis. And they use most modern methods of industrial organization. So these are the characteristics of the manufacturing sector. So this model assumes a dual economic structure with manufacturing sector on one side. The characteristics of the manufacturing sector are the manufacturing sector uses reproducible capital, and it produces for the market, it produces for the profit, it employs labor on wage payment, and it uses most modern methods of industrial organization. On the other hand, we have the agriculture sector. Agriculture represents the subsistence or traditional sector using non-reproducible land on self-employment basis. and producing mainly for self-consumption with inferior techniques of production, containing surplus labor in the form of disguised unemployment. Disguised unemployment is a case where the marginal productivity of labor falls to zero, becomes zero. That means the laborers are not at all required there. Although they are working, they are not required. That's the meaning. Even if we withdraw the labor from production, the output remains the same. So see the important characteristics of the subsistence sector or agriculture sector. Production is for self-consumption. They use inferior techniques, not modern techniques. And these traditional sectors have surplus labor, and there is the presence of disguised unemployment. So this Lewis model assumes a dual economic structure. The next important assumption is rural labor migration and urban employment generation are conditioned by industrial investment and capital formation. This is another important assumption. There is rural labor migration and urban employment generation. They are conditioned by industrial investment and capital formation. So if there is more industry, there is industrial development in the urban areas, that will lead to the migration of laborers from the rural area to the urban area. So simply speaking, the migration of labor from rural area to urban area is conditioned, that will depend upon the progress of industrial investment and capital formation taking place in the economy. Next, capital reinvest all their profits. So capital reinvest all their profits. So profit is not used for any other purpose. It is used for reinvestment. Real rural wage is determined by average product of labor. So based on the average product of labor, rural wage is given. Then urban wage is higher than the rural wage. This is a usual phenomena. Urban wage is higher than the rural wage. Next, the supply of labor to the modern sector is perfectly elastic. That is what I have shown with the help of this figure. This perfectly elastic supply. So supply of labor to the modern sector is perfectly elastic. Next, there is surplus labor in the rural agriculture sector. That's the starting point of this theory. This assumption actually is the starting point of the theory. There is surplus labor in the rural agriculture sector. Now we will explain the theory, explanation of the theory. Let's suppose that the wage level in the modern sector is constant. So wage in the modern sector or industrial sector is constant and is higher than the subsistence wage agriculture sector. Let's suppose agriculture wage, wage in the agriculture sector is 150. Then the wage in the modern sector will at least be higher than this 150, say it 180. So it simply means the modern sector offers higher wage compared to the traditional subsistence agriculture sector. Next, this wage differential induces the rural workers to migrate from the rural sector to the urban sector. So if there is wage difference, of course, the people will be migrating from the rural sector to the urban sector. Then we have missed one sentence. See here, Lewis assumes that the urban wage rate are at least 30% higher than the average rural wage. This is an important assumption. 30% more will be the urban wage rate compared to the rural wage rate. So this wage differential actually induces rural workers to migrate from the rural sector to the urban sector. At the constant urban wage, the supply of labor, the supply curve of labor to the modern sector is perfectly elastic. That we have discussed. This can be explained with the help of the following figure. See here, this is x-axis where we show the labor supply and labor demand. Here, the vertical axis shows two things: marginal product and wage rate. So we are showing the marginal product and wage rate along the vertical axis, and horizontal axis shows the labor supply and labor demand. So here we have capital expansion and growth in labor employment. See the explanation of the theory. The horizontal axis measures the quantity of labor and the vertical axis measures wage and the marginal product. SS represents the subsistence wage. SS represents the subsistence wage. So this is a subsistence wage. Yes, this is a subsistence wage. And WW shows industrial wage. This is an industrial wage. WW, this is industrial wage. See, the industrial wage is somewhat higher than the subsistence wage. At the wage OW, first is the OW, the supply of labor is unlimited. So at the wage OW, the supply of labor is unlimited. That is perfectly elastic. WW. So this curve shows that in the beginning, when the OL1 labor is employed, suppose that we are employing OL1 labor, the marginal productivity curve is DQ1. So when you employ the OL1 labor, the marginal productivity is DQ1, this one, marginal productivity. And the total output is ODQ1L1. This is the total output. I will mark the total output once again. This is the total output. This is the total output. This much area is the total output. Okay. So when the wage rate, when the OL1 labors are employed, we get the total output this much area. Out of this total output, workers are paid wage equal to the area OWQ1L. OWQ1L. This is a worker's wage. This is the worker's wage. And the remaining WDQ1, this is a WDQ1, this area. That's a surplus or the profit of the capitalist. This is a surplus or the profit of the capitalist. So by assumption, the capitalist will reinvest the surplus or the profit. When this surplus is reinvested, the marginal product curve shifts upwards to the equity. So when this is reinvested, the marginal product curve will shift upwards. It becomes EQ2. The capitalist surplus and the wages and the employment are now larger than before, being WEQ2. So therefore, now they are employing OL2 amount of labor. Further, there is total output created this much area, and this much is the cost, or that is cost in the form of the wage. Then this much will be reinvested again. Then as a result, marginal productivity curve will be shifted. It will become FQ3 and demand for labor increases. So this process will go on. So further, reinvestments of surplus profit raise the marginal productivity curve and the level of employment to FQ3 and OIL3 respectively, and so on till the entire surplus labor is absorbed in the capitalist sector. So through this way, again, there will be shift. There will be more output, and this process will continue until all labors, excess labors, are absorbed in the capitalist sector. Now we will critically evaluate this theory. So in this theory, it is very clear that as the capitalist reinvest the surplus, then there will be scope for demanding more labors from the agriculture sector. So as a result, more labor will come from the agriculture sector to the industrial sector, and this process will continue until all excess labor, surplus labors from the agriculture sector or subsistence sector are absorbed, employed in the industrial sector or capitalist sector. So this is how the transformation happens, economic development happens according to Arthur Lewis. So the surplus labor from the agriculture sector will be completely taken over by the industrial sector through this process, and through that an economy can achieve higher and higher levels of economic development according to Arthur Lewis. Now we will critically examine this theory. Lewis is criticized on the following grounds. The theory assumes that wage rate is constant in the capitalist sector. This is an unrealistic assumption. So see here, wage rate is constant here, or constant at OW. This one. And it will remain constant according to the theory, but we know that it is unlikely to remain because of several factors. The wage rate may go up. If wage rate is raised, then naturally the profit will be reduced. A reinvestable surplus will be reduced with the capitalist, and this will limit the capitalist ability to absorb more labor from the agriculture sector. This theory is criticized on the ground that the wage rate is assumed to be constant in the capitalist sector, but this is an unrealistic assumption. Wage rate may increase as the industrial sector develops. Second important criticism of this theory is that the theory cannot be applied if capital accumulation is labor, if technology which we use is labor saving. So if you use more labor saving technologies, then the economy will not be able to absorb more labor from the agriculture sector to the industrial sector. So therefore, unemployment will still prevail there. So the theory cannot be applied if capital accumulation, if technology which we use is labor saving. Now, Lewis assumes the existence of unskilled labor, but skill can be increased by providing training and education. So it assumes that there is unskilled labor, but we know that skill can be increased through providing education and training. Lewis assumes the existence of an enterprising people in underdeveloped economies, but many less developed economies lack capitalists with necessary enterprise and initiative. So this theory is built on the presumption that there is enough enterprising people in the underdeveloped economies. Then only the capitalist sector will work, industrial sector will work. But we know that many of the less developed economies lack the existence of sufficient number of the capitalists to attract more laborers to the traditional agriculture sector. Fifth point, multiplier process does not fully operate in underdeveloped economies. So this is based on multiplier concept, but we know that this multiplier that may not operate fully in underdeveloped economies. Next criticism, this is a one-sided theory because Lewis does not consider the possibility of progress in the agriculture sector. So here, we withdraw the labor from the agriculture sector to the industrial sector, thereby leading to the development of the industrial sector. But the theory is almost silent about what is happening to the agriculture sector. So the progress of the agriculture sector does not come under the explanation of this theory. It just deals with the progress that the industrial sector can achieve by withdrawing labor from the agriculture sector. So it is some way silent about the progress that is likely to happen in the agriculture sector. Next, Lewis does not study the problem of aggregate demand. So here there is no mention about the aggregate demand. Now, mobility of labor from the rural sector to the urban sector is not as easy as explained in the theory. So this is very non-fact that we believe that the rural sector from the people will move from the rural sector to the urban sector. But it is not as easy because there may be more restrictions for the moment, and it requires more transportation, and it requires the urban sector to provide more and more amenities to the rural people. Then only they will be attracted to the urban sector. Wage is not only the single factor attracting the people to move from the rural sector to the urban sector. Besides wage, many factors may be at work to attract the laborers from the rural sector to urban sector, but the theory does not explain the factors other than wage that could promote the people or motivate the people to move away from the rural sector to the urban sector. Now, last criticism is economists argue that the marginal productivity of labor is not zero in the agriculture sector, as claimed by this theory. So theory claims that marginal productivity of labor in the agriculture sector is zero, but that is not the situation. The economist general argument is that marginal productivity of labor is not always zero in the agriculture sector, but the theory claims that it is zero. So this is another important criticism leveled against this theory. Yes, we have seen how the labor is drawn from the agriculture sector or subsistence sector to the industrial sector, and how the development takes place, economic development takes place through the Lewis theory of unlimited supplies of labor. And finally, we see that the criticisms are very interesting because the foundation on which Arthur Lewis has built the theory is some way a wrong foundation, because it assumes many unrealistic things. So with this, we end this presentation.